Eric! Dagon slammed the doors of the war room open and strode toward the High Marshal, who was hunched over a vellum scroll between the grand hearth filled with flame and a table strewn in maps. Eric lifted his eyes. He had tied his hair back, revealing the ancient runes etched at the base of his neck. Like the runes trailing up his fingers, wrists, and arms, these continued to his shoulders and down his back beneath his tunic. "What is the meaning of this?" Dagon said. He hastened across the floor, passing through the strips of moonlight that spanned the stone from high windows. His sword, sheathed at his side, swayed in time with the chinks from chainmail, stretched across his chest as he marched. "You'll have to be more specific," Eric said, straightening his back. "My men tell me you called them back!" Dagon's face was as red as his hair, save for his scars stretching across the side of his face like the white branches of a birch tree. "My men, my warmen, who I personally trained, command and sent up for Kallan." "That's right," Eric said, as calm as ever, as Dagon planted his fists on the top of the table and leaned in. The captain's copper eyes flashed with murder. "What are you doing?" he asked. There was a cold calm in Eric's demeanor as he studied Dagon, whose tunic, cloak, and trousers looked travel-worn. Filth from the road covered him from his wild red hair to his muddy boots. "I'm bringing them in," Eric answered. "Kallan is out there!" Dagon extended a finger to the door behind him. "We can't afford the troops," Eric said. "But those are my men!" Eric palmed his fist on the table. With a sigh, Eric rechecked his composure and surrendered the last of his attention to the seething captain. As he circled around the table, the firelight caught the strange runic markings on his wrists. "Lorlenalin is vulnerable," Eric said, doing his best to look interested. "The more men we have dispersed in search, the less we have here on hand in Lorlenalin's defense." Eric stopped at the table's end, leaving at least 3 arm lengths between him and Dagon. Dagon's hard stare darkened. "Gunir hasn't moved since the king and Kallan vanished," Dagon said. "You know this. The Dark One sits, preening himself on the throne, and you've worried of an attack? Gunir knows we are without queen. They know we are vulnerable. If they're going to make a move, they would have done so by now, a fortnight ago." "Lorlenalin has lost its fountainhead," Eric said. "I am left with few resources to keep this sitting running. If Gunir does decide to move, Lorlenalin will fall." Dagon's wide chest heaved with each breath. "You would turn your back to Kallan!" "I do not have the luxury to grieve," Eric said. "I have a responsibility. While your place is on the battlefield fighting alongside our queen, my work is here among the scribes. And as much as I want to ride out and find her, as much as it pains me to say it, I must stay here and order what only is best for Kallan City and her people, and not for Kallan herself. Regardless of how much I hate it, I must do this. Need I remind you that I am captain?" Dagon spoke through his teeth. "I oversee decisions made in regards to Kallan's woman, and will it do to remind you that I am High Marshal?" Eric's voice boomed to the high vaulted ceiling. "I oversee decisions made in regard to Kallan's court. My duty, first and foremost, is to draw up the inventory and account for all the men, Kallan's warmen, and in times of crisis, am I not free to reassign them where I feel they are needed the most?" The fire crackled as Dagon appeared to search for the rebuttal to gain the upper hand. "Are we not in a time of crisis, Captain?" Eric said. "We are." Dagon seemingly shoved the words from his mouth. "I did not override your warmen, your position, or your orders," Eric sighed. "As High Marshal, I reassigned them." "Kallan needs us. Her people need us," Eric said. "Her people come first." Dagon tightened his already whitened fists. "The people you seek to protect adored Kallan long before she ascended the throne. Wherever she goes, they will loyally, eagerly follow, and they have a right to go." Dagon exhaled. "We all do." Eric narrowed his eyes. "You sound like someone who already has lives lined up." 10,000 citizens wait for Kallan's return," Dagon said, "many of whom would be willing to ride out for her at the word." Eric shook his head, exhaling his frustration. It was with a calm voice that he spoke again. "As High Marshal, I have no choice but to act in the best interests of the people. Nor will I waste what few resources we have hunting for one girl." "Queen," Dagon corrected. A flash of anger passed through Eric's eyes before settling again. "I will go after her myself," Dagon said, and marched from the table. "Dagon, that's Kira's daughter out there!" Dagon spun about on his heel. Eric's blood drained as memories of Kira smiling, Kira laughing, Kira dying flashed and faded, leaving him pale. He forced down a gulp that seemed to stir up his blood again. "It do you well to remember, Captain, that your duty first and foremost is to protect the people of Lorlenalin, not one girl," Eric said, forcing the words through a stiff bottom jaw. Both wills unbending, both decisions made, a suspended silence hung between them. "My queen is in need of my services," Dagon said, dismissing himself. His boots clomped with every single stride toward the door, while Eric forced his head clear. He couldn't risk a rogue captain leading Fan to Kallan, and battled the urge to raise his hands and arms. "If you leave the city, I will have no choice but to record that you abandoned your post." Eric's voice filled the room up to the crossbeams as Dagon stood not moving. "I will have no choice but to find you insubordinate, and charge you thus," Eric said. The fire popped. "Traitor," Eric said, leaving the word to sit in the air between them. Without a word, Dagon passed through each strip of moonlight splayed upon the stone floor, didn't bother closing the doors behind him. Dagon pulled Thor's saddle strap taut before looping it back through the metal clasp as ancient memories passed through his thoughts. The horse master and stable hands bustled about, paying him no mind as his fingers moved, pulling back the lever. "In so many ways you are just like her father," Gudrun said. Dagon held his eyes on the saddle. "Begone with you, hag," he grumbled. Ignoring his insults, the old woman joined him at the horse's side. "Your station commands you stay," she said. "My loyalties demand I go." Dagon tugged the saddle's belt before grabbing the bit and bridle from the wall. "And where will you go, Dagon? That you haven't already looked?" she asked. "I can't do nothing!" Dagon said. The lantern light caught the worry in Gudrun's eyes. "I promised him, Gudrun." He slid the bit into Thor's mouth and fastened the bridle in place. "The tide has not yet changed, Dagon," Gudrun said. "How can you know that?" Dagon said. "How can you possibly know? With your sight blinded for nearly a fortnight now." "Only parts," Gudrun kindly corrected. "All you have seen is the Darkwind perched patiently on the throne," he said. "He isn't even looking for his king." A loud bang filled the grotto, followed by a series of shouting stable hands in a corner. Gudrun dropped her voice beneath the ruckus. "Dagon, I assure you, if I could see her, if I knew where she was, I would ride out with you myself." With a grunt, he shook his head, heavy with doubt. "The road ahead is unchanged regardless of whether you go or stay," Gudrun said. "Stay, until I at least see a change in the tides." Exhaustion and wear visibly pulled on Dagon's face, bearing down on his back. With a sigh, he pushed his hand through his hair, then rubbed his face wrought with worry. "Where is she?" The embers glowed red in Rune's pipe as he turned the hilt of her dagger over in his hands. Taking it back from Kallan while she slept had been too easy. He shifted his eyes over her body, half hidden beneath the overcoat. She slept undisturbed beside the dying fire, content and unaware of the pawns aligned, oblivious to the pot she played. Streams of smoke billowed from his mouth, then rolled into the air as he watched. The last of the fire smoldered. Kallan's words played over in his head as Rune examined each word, each sigh. Kallan stirred and uttered a name. "Ori." Heat clawed Rune's chest. His insurmountable waves of hate toward the Dvagar burned his insides raw. The urge to kill was agonizing. He brooded as he counted the players. A Dvagar king who murdered a queen. Rune pulled a long draw from his pipe. A dead Dokova king. He released the smoke as he exhaled. The Sudkona queen Kallan. Rune lowered his pipe, resting his arm loosely on his knee. And Borg, the mercenary. He recalled Borg's face as the mercenary pleaded with him to take Kallan from the stables. The exact moment he dropped his hand to his shoulder and left the lines of Saith within him awake and followed the rage, the vile contempt reserved in the shadow that had lurked in the core since. The beast. Rune blew the smoke and watched it billow, then looked again to Kallan. Her slender, pale face reflected the light of the moon. It was full tonight. A message of peace that has failed time and again to reach the ears of the queen, and a pouch with mystical apples. "Why do you grieve?" he whispered to the sleeping Dokofar. The fire that burned in her eyes did well to mask the grief she had buried in the shadows of her mind. She seemed content to ignore the pain that ate its way through her, hollowing her out, consuming her, until the empty shell of a woman driven mad would remain. Rune exhaled and watched the smoke rising as it twisted into the air above him. Elf, Kallan, Borg. She was breathtaking, bathed in moonlight. The Dvagar king Monsignor. He took another long draw. The dead queen mother. The smoke billowed. The abduction of the Dokapa queen. All for the want of a pouch. Rune's gut churned with intuition that would leave him sleepless that night. Ori. He gazed upon her serene face. The unease between them would spread, but certain questions needed answers. Through certain words would increase hostilities. With every question asked, he knew he would be closer to evoking her rage. Time would not only be on his side, but necessity pushed caution aside. He planned the order, the balance, the tension, the gradual move to the one topic he dared not breach, lest her guard be raised and her safe fly. And the apples. He would have to coax her into telling him about the apples. Yes. Let's see how well you lie, princess. Let's see how stubborn you really are. Rune sighed and took a long draw on the pipe. What he needed was for her to trust him. Before she wakes, I'll give back the dagger. The light of Alfheim's moon gleamed brightly in the deep black of Bergen's eyes, reflected there like bottomless black pools of water. Throwing his head back, he took a long drink from his flask, then wiped his mouth with his hand. Moonlight bathed the city in shadows of blue and white. Gunir stone houses twisted around the streets, creating a maze of thatch and stone. They hugged the base of the keep's battlement, perched atop the moat. This night, the silence seemed to reach to the ends of Alfheim. The wench, asleep in his bed, released a groan that became a sigh, drawing Bergen's attention from the window. His eyes grazed her bare flesh, lingering for a moment on the exposed skin soaked in moonbeam. With a gleam in his eye, Bergen gulped down another swig, and, dressed only in trousers, quietly made his way into his sitting room, leaving Gretchen, or Gertrude, undisturbed by his restlessness. Was smiling to himself for a job well done, Bergen stepped out into the landing between the war room and his chambers, and closed the door behind him. His stomach growled, and he washed back another gulp, content with a solitude he rarely found. After fixing his thoughts on cook's kitchens, he sauntered down the steps to the great hall. The silence from the late summer night permeated the castle's keep, as the sleeping servants doused Gunir in a peace they could never accomplish awake, with their eagerness to serve. He'd made it as far as the stairwell window, halfway down the steps, before recalling the last time he'd picked at the unguarded assortment of salted meats hanging in the larder. A night that had begun with innocent pilfering had turned into a severe tongue-lashing that ended with a wooden spoon across his hide. After a low-down threat to tell Rune, cook had made him promise never to touch the kitchen's ladders again. Though odious, the blackmail had earned his respect, and ended the night in much the same position as Gertrude, or Gretchen, asleep in his chambers, to compensate for his late-night thievery, of course. Abandoning any thoughts of his late-night lunch, Bergen veered widely away from the kitchens at the base of the steps, and instead swaggered into the great hall, throwing his head back for another swig. It was with a guilty eye that he shifted to gaze to the empty throne, and chugged down another gulp of mead, replaying his last conversation with Rune, until the words echoed back on themselves. I need to go after her. If I'm not back by the next new moon, come find me. Tell no one that you've seen me. And Bergen had done just that, much to the chagrin of Rune. The castle's old keeper had been like a mother to them, and had squawked and clucked as loud as a hen when Bergen refused to speak. Rune had ridden off on the Slipkona's dark steed, leaving behind more questions than he had answered, and more responsibility than Bergen cared for. That was 14 nights ago. With careless grace, Bergen stumped up the 5 steps to the empty throne, sequestered between a pair of pillars etched with animals and runes, and dropped himself into the chair. As he threw back another gulp of mead, Bergen eyed the pair of grand iron wheels suspended from the trusses over 2 long tables. A thick layer of hardened wax had melted and molded around the iron and fallen to drip on the tables. Bergen looked past the pillars to the double oak doors of the great hall. In all my years, I don't think I've ever seen you seated on your father's throne, came a familiar gruff voice. Galf's large, bear-like frame emerged from behind the wooden screen passage set behind the throne. With a glint of mischief in the old codger's eye, he stopped short at the base of the throne steps. The weight of a crown is heavy, Bergen said. I like living without the burden. Besides, he shrugged, such a life would never permit me the freedom to frolic as much as I do. Bergen grinned, tipping the mouth of the flask to his lips, as Geralf grunted at the man-child seated on the throne. A throne doesn't suit you, Geralf grumbled. If I recall, you always were a stubborn child, quick to a strike and eager to ignore. With a grin that flashed in his round black eyes, Bergen proudly chugged back another gulp and released a flatulent-sounding grunt in his brother's chair. Geralf pretended not to notice, learning long ago that it was never good to encourage the mischief sparkle in Bergen's eyes. I find it implausible that you know nothing of the disappearance of Queen Kallan or your brother, the old man grunted at the youth. Where is he? Geralf waited for Bergen to speak. Instead, the dark one grinned again from behind the flask, catching a bit of light with a scar on his bright brow. Geralf brought his voice down with a bit more severity than before. Rune is nowhere to be found. The dock of our queen is unaccounted for, and you haven't even sent a single party to locate either monarch in more than a fortnight. I don't want to. Gareth sighed long and low. Where is your brother? I don't know. Bergen's words were dry as if over-rehearsed. Gareth expanded his chest, inhaling a large helping of patience, and climbed the steps to the throne. His wide frame towered over Bergen, barely dwarfing the berserker. He braced each hand on the armrests and bent low until his nose stopped inches from Bergen's. You show up a fortnight ago, stripped of your bow, your boots, and reeking of imported Thash grape ale, with nothing more than a grin and some story about a rose, a goat, and a ring. It was a great night, Bergen beamed. One I will never forget, he added with a dazed look as though in a mist. A small vein on Gareth's forehead pulsed. For the sake of an old man who desperately looks to end the ceaseless nagging of Torun's maternal woes, please, he said, tell me where your brother is. Bergen sympathetically dropped a hand to Gareth's shoulder. As much of my pity as you may have, Bergen said with feigned devoutedness. I have been sworn to secrecy under the command of my king. Gareth stared at the twinkle in Bergen's eyes. How noble! Gareth grumbled, the wide smile pasted upon Bergen's face. When will he be back? I don't know. Is the Dagolfar with him? I don't know. Is she dead? I don't know. Gareth released the chair, exhaling a patient breath. As he straightened his spine, he locked his ice-blue eyes on Bergen, who returned the glare Bergen had learned from him. Before the new moon? He gasped. Before the new moon, Bergen agreed. Gareth nodded, giving his consent to the plan the boys had designed without him. And if the brother has not returned before the next moon? Gareth asked unpleasantly. I have orders to find him. The answer was sufficient to allow Gareth to draw up his shoulders, and he descended the throne. He took a single step and peered over his shoulder. Bergen had resumed his drinking. What am I going to tell Torun for the next fortnight? Gulping down the last of the mead, Bergen flushed a grin that glowed in his eyes long after Gareth closed in the grand doors behind him.